Welcome everyone to our webinar, The Future of Electronic Meetings. We thought this would be a very timely topic given the recent change in restrictions regarding COVID restrictions in BC. So electronic meetings for Stratus, how did we get here? Back in March 2020, when the state of emergency was declared, probably not many of us thought of doing our AGMs and SGMs electronically. But then in April 2020, the government allowed us to do them without an enabling bylaw. I don't think very many stratas actually had a bylaw allowing electronic general meetings. And we've learned a lot since then. I like this quote, "None of us is as smart as all of us." We have literally been learning from each other for the last over a year and a half, and quite a few ideas, innovative ideas have come out of that. We've learned that we can still learn new tricks. We've learned how to adapt very quickly. We've learned some best practices. Communication is key. Transparency with our owners, collaborating with our owners, and that overall we're quite resilient as strata corporations and strata owners. Did anyone even hear of Zoom before March 2020? I hadn't, but I love this. I told a joke at a Zoom meeting and it wasn't remotely funny. So here are some of the things that we have learned from each other over this time regarding registration. One of the things that people have found, and here I'm going to be talking a lot about Zoom because for some reason it tends to be the platform that most people have been using over this time. So one of the ways that some stratas have managed registration is using the waiting room in Zoom. And they've allowed people to sit in the waiting room and then admit them one by one so that they can check who the person is and that they actually are an eligible voter. Another way is that some stratas have let everyone in all at once, and then they've done a roll call by strata lot. Is the owner of strata lot 1 here, strata lot 2 here, etc., and identifying either the owner or the person who's the proxy for that strata lot. Either of those methods have often incorporated personal ID codes. So a strata would use a tool. There's lots of online tools where they would generate unique codes, sometimes with letters and numbers, sometimes just numbers. And then that person would identify them by that number at the time of the roll call or the waiting room entry. So that's a sort of a method that works maybe in larger stratas where people don't know each other so well. Smaller stratas maybe not necessary since you do all know each other. And then once they're in the Zoom meeting, a lot of stratas were doing some sort of naming strategy. So they might put the strata lot number in that name of the attendee. They might put the number of proxies that person is holding, or the total votes that that person is representing, or the name of the person, or a combination of any of those bits of information. Every strata was doing that a little bit differently, and that's okay. So recapping that, for registration, we learned about ways to use the waiting room, the roll call, personal ID codes, naming strategies. Where things got interesting was voting cards. How did we use voting cards? Not really. But one thing we learned is that we can't restrict attendance, for example, in person. So we saw a lot of stratas doing all electronic, but we also saw some who were doing a portion in person and a portion electronically, but they couldn't restrict the number of people in attendance in person. We also learned a lot about proxies. The buzzword for that year was restricted proxies. So since January 2021, the CRT has had some decisions about restricted proxies. And the first decision that came down was this one called Bailwich versus the owners of LMS 317. So anyone who wants to read CRT decisions, just go to their website. But this was kind of groundbreaking and very helpful because it helped us understand not to use them. many of the things about proxies have never changed. We knew the rules before, and we should know the rules now. But something that came to light in many of these CRT decisions was just reminding us of the proper procedure for proxies. So they have to be certified. The issues with the restricted proxy forms had a lot to do with the choices that were put on the proxy forms. For example, allowing discretion for the person who is the proxy. We also learned and were reminded that you can't impose a certain person to hold all the proxies. Under the Strata Property Act, we have the choice of naming anybody to be our proxy. It was also reminded that proxy forms aren't ballots. So you can't submit a proxy form and count all of the votes for those motions ahead of time. The proxy must be present to cast the vote, and the number of votes cannot be counted until the voting begins for that particular motion. So what did we learn about voting methods for electronic meetings? Some stratas were using that raise hand feature to cast votes. And that worked okay for the owners who were joining the meeting through the internet. It was harder for people joining by phone, but there is the method like we use today, the star method, so that those people could vote. So that was one way. Didn't really work so well though with proxies. Another way was what we did today with the Zoom poll. So on the left, you can see what it looks like when you're voting. And on the right, you can see what the chair sees when the votes have all come in, because it shows not just the percentage, but the number of people in the room and the number of votes cast. There is an anonymous option on these polls as well. So people could choose, and you may have seen this when you voted today, that you could choose to vote anonymously if you wished. Another way that some stratas were voting was using the private Zoom chat. Now, to me, that's not terribly effective if you have a large group, but for some stratas, they were doing this. So what they would do is they would choose the private chat to the chair only and cast their vote that way. Another method that some stratas were using was by email. So early on, some of these emails were going just to say the Strata Council address. But later, I did hear of some stratas who were hiring someone to be a professional scrutineer. So no one on council, no other owners in the strata would see these emails. They would all be sent to an email address where that scrutineer was. The scrutineer would count the votes and then announce them to the chair and then destroy all of the records of those emails. Now, one of the troubles with that is hiring the person. So it could be quite expensive to hire that person, because in those stratas, they wanted someone who was bonded. Of course, another method was going door to door. So I knew some stratas who would pause the meeting for 15 minutes, half an hour, and then go door to door and have people put their ballots in a ballot box. That was time consuming. If you had a lot of votes with secret ballots, it was a long, unmanageable meeting, and not everybody joined the meeting again after one of the votes. So that was a bit not a great solution. Another way of voting was by roll call. And for stratas of a certain size, that was very effective. And it was also a way that accommodated the proxy voting. So here's just a recap of those methods, again, that various stratas had come up with to deal with voting during electronic meetings. The question at the bottom is voting cards. So we'll get to that in a minute. And then what did we learn about voting in elections? All of these methods technically could be used for elections as well. However, in many of our bylaws, we like that option of doing a secret ballot if it's called for. So we'll get to that in a minute too. What's coming down the line though? Some of you participated in a test of a new platform a few weeks ago and gave some great constructive feedback to the developers of the things that you'd like to see improved. But the key point here is that systems are in development, and there's at least one platform that is catering to the BC market so that they can comply with the BC Strata Property Act. And some of the things that they found solutions for are identifying people during the registration process, resolving the problem of proxy voting so that you can vote one way for yourself, you can vote another way for your proxies. It also calculates the results quite easily. It manages fractional votes, and you might not know that unless you're in a strata that has commercial units, but quite often you might have a commercial unit that has 2.3 votes and the owners have 1 vote, that type of thing. So calculating that can be quite cumbersome. A system that recognizes that can resolve that easily. Secret ballots. They've also come up with a way to do truly secret ballots electronically, and ballots for elections as well. There's also the question of, do we need to do, or do we want to consider any bylaw amendments to adapt our bylaws to these new meeting formats? So let's look at the standard bylaws for a second. Standard bylaw 27 says that at an annual or special general meeting, voting cards must be issued to eligible voters. So just keep voting cards in mind for a second. A vote is decided on a show of voting cards unless an eligible voter requests a precise count. So that's interesting now. How do you do voting cards during an electronic meeting? If a precise count is requested, the chair must decide whether it will be by a show of voting cards or by roll call, secret ballot, or some other method. So some other method allowed us to do some of these electronic voting. But again, there's something here that we might want to consider as owners for changes in these bylaws. The outcome of each vote, including the number of votes for and against the resolution, if a precise count is requested, must be announced by the chair and recorded in the minutes. So that raises the question, why do we only do a precise count in some situations? Why don't we do a precise count all the time? That's just a question. Then if we go to standard bylaw 28, it mentions voting cards again by saying that the order of business includes the certifying of proxies and corporate representatives and issuing voting cards. So all of the things in bold, secret ballots, voting cards, precise counts, let's think about those for a minute. Voting cards really work for physical attendance when you're in a room. Do we need voting cards when we vote in an electronic meeting? Do you want to consider looking at your bylaws and coming up with a solution that allows both voting cards physically at a meeting and some other methods such as your electronic registration process? Is that sufficient for the same purpose as voting cards? Do we need language that reflects that we might be attending the meeting in multiple ways? Right now, the way the standard bylaw reads, it makes it sound like it's either or. Either it's all electronic or it's all in person. So there's very simple ways that you might consider massaging those standard bylaws to make it clear that you can have people attending in multiple ways. Another question that's come up is, should a physical meeting always be required? So that's something that your strata can talk about. Then when it comes to voting methods, right now, the way the standard bylaw reads, it makes it sound like your vote has to be just one method. All voting cards, all roll call, that type of thing. Maybe we need language in there that reflects that there could be multiple ways. You might have some people in a room voting with a voting card, other people electronically using a method like the poll, or perhaps some of the new technology that's coming. And you might have other people voting by email or some other method. Right now, the standard bylaw doesn't really contemplate that you might have all of these methods happening at once. The other thing is, right now, it basically says that the vote is always by voting cards unless another method is determined by the chair after someone requests a precise count. So why do we need to request a precise count to be able to use another method? Maybe you want to talk about, do you need a precise count for all votes, which is actually quite practical now that we're going to have more of these methods that calculate automatically. These are all things that are up to you. But also, here's some of the questions about secret ballots. What is a secret ballot anyway? What you perceive a secret ballot is not necessarily what it is. There's a groundbreaking case a number of years ago in the Supreme Court called IMBO versus StrataPlan NW 971. And what the Supreme Court judge decided is that a special levy was found to be null and void because when they did a secret ballot, there was no private booth for voters to fill out their secret ballots. So this raises the question, all these years when you've been doing secret ballots, have you been doing it this way? Probably that's not what you thought that it meant and not what it was intended. So without losing the concept of wanting your vote to be private, is there another way to achieve that without using the word secret and having to trigger what the Supreme Court says we have to do by creating a voting booth? We've literally heard stories where the Strata created voting booths, but nobody wanted to get up out of their chair and walk to the voting booth to cast their vote. They just wanted to sit in their chair and fill out the piece of paper. So what is the point in having a voting booth then? So in 2018, the BC Law Institute made a recommendation about those words, and they suggested changing the words secret ballot to written ballot. So now, a couple of years later, now that we're doing electronic meetings, here's something to ask ourselves. Should it be written ballot or should it be written or electronic ballot? So here are the questions that you as an ownership can discuss and decide what you want. We have to remember secret ballot isn't in the Strata Property Act, it's in the bylaws. So bylaws can be amended. So what is right for your owners? Perhaps think about the concept of a secret ballot and think about how you want to achieve that and what methods you might use in your strata to be able to cast a ballot in a way that doesn't identify the person who has cast the ballot, keeping their vote private, and yet considering the different methods that might be out there to achieve that. This all comes down to every strata is different. What's right for you? What we have learned, best practices over this time, is to have good communication with our owners, get input from our owners. We want to have a transparent process, but we also learned that we have to be flexible with new technologies coming along. So we want that wording in our bylaws to allow a little bit of flexibility. Another thing that we learned in the last year and a half is to be inclusive. Some stratas were only allowing people to join online, but not on phone. Is that right? Up to your strata. Personally, I think we should be as inclusive as possible. Another thing is just to take these ideas to your strata lawyer. Once you've decided what you think you want, get your strata lawyer to review it and then actually write the wording for you to make sure that those bylaws are well written. All right, well, that brings us to the end of today's webinar. Thank you so much for joining.